When was the first time that you heard no means no in relation to intimacy between two people? Those three words were pretty much the entire curriculum of consent education that, for generations of Australians, is what we got. For decades, that was it. My guest today was the catalyst for fundamentally changing how consent education works in Australia. In 2021, Chanel Contos posted on Instagram, and I'll quote, "Have you or a close friend been sexually assaulted by someone who went to an all-boys school in Sydney?" Close quote. Now, within 24 hours, 204 separate people had responded yes to the question. Within 72 hours, Chanel was doing her first ever live TV interview. That weekend, her mate started a website for Chanel, and over the following 3 weeks, she collected 6,000 testimonies. She started a petition that would demand consent education in schools. And after 45,000 signatures, a long year of phone calls and many, many meetings, exactly 1 year from when she first posted on Instagram, the 9 education ministers in Australia unanimously agreed and then publicly announced that they would indeed mandate consent education in schools. Chanel Contos is a force of nature. She's a fierce advocate for consent education and the brilliant brain behind the Teach Us Consent campaign. Chanel has been instrumental in raising awareness about sexual assault and consent in Australia. Now, today, we're going to discuss the challenges of navigating relationships in this era of dating apps. We're going to explore the disturbing influence of pornography on our understanding of consent. Chanel highlights the need to extend empathy beyond our immediate circles, teaching both young men and women how that they can prioritise their own desires, but more importantly, saying no and how to say no when it matters most. Chanel's got some really valuable lessons, not just about preventing sexual violence, but also around creating a culture of respect and a culture of understanding. She strongly believes that showing young men that healthy, consensual relationships are something that they should aspire to can ultimately help change the world. Chanel's book is called Consent Laid Bare. It's absolutely stunning. It's out right now. And obviously there's a very big content warning up the top here because a conversation around consent can't be had without talking about what happens when consent is not there. I'll be amazed if Chanel Contos isn't PM one day. She's a total weapon and an absolute delight to engage with. I hope you enjoy Chanel Contos. Thanks for coming around.
Thanks for having me.
How are you going today? Thanks for the book.
You're welcome. Oh God, I'm actually so jet lagged today. I was literally laying outside the concrete in your house.
How good is the sun? Though?
Yeah, I know. It was so good. I was just laying absorbing the sun. But no, I'm so pumped and everything's so fun.
You're in London at the moment. When did you get back?
A few days ago.
Right, yeah. Coming this way is hard.
Yeah, it is. It's always worse this way, isn't it? And I feel like I stay awake when I can't, like I wake up really early, which is what makes me tired or like I struggle to sleep rather than being like, I'm so tired.
Do you want another coffee? I make good coffee.
No, I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Are you sure?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
I'm good.
All right. Why did you want to go to uni over there?
The course they had was really interesting. I couldn't find anything like it in Australia. And I do think the education is like better. I definitely had a better experience learning over there than I did when I studied in Australia. A university experience? Yeah, so I did 2 degrees in Australia, undergraduate, and then... Just the 2? And then I did a master's in London. So there's 3 in total, but I definitely felt like I had a much better university experience. Even though it was COVID and all online, I still feel like I learnt way more and that I was way more engaged with my professors and lecturers than I kind of ever had in Australia. Wow. Yeah, which is also... So I used to teach at uni in Australia. That was like my job before all of this. And I used to think it was so bad that I used to teach because I was like, I don't know this well enough. And I was like, no wonder I didn't learn anything when I was a student because the people teaching me didn't know anything either. And all those HECS fees that are breaking people's backs for the quality of... Yeah, like the indexing now, like 7%. It's criminal. That's hectic. That is 7% on like a lot of money. Yeah. Yeah, it's unfair. Yeah. Particularly most of those decisions are made by people who are sitting in Parliament right now that got their education free. Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, a whole gen of Australians who didn't have to pay for uni.
we're here to talk about education, but I don't think there's any greater investment you can make.
Yeah.
In a country, but education, because with education comes inoculation from bullshit.
Yeah. They have that, like, all the Scandi countries, like, pay people to go to uni. Like, they get scholarships and, like, student living funds.
Right.
And it just means the countries work so well.
Well, look, that's because they took that sweet, sweet fossil fuel money and put it into their country rather like us, which just give it away and sell it by the buttload. And no, we can't possibly tax those companies. It'd be terrible. We'd drive them out of the country.
I know, like, looking at how much, like, massive companies paid in taxes, like, last year and being like, oh, I'm really glad that, like, me as a 25-year-old paid more tax. Like, that's good. It's
you want to talk about, disengagement of a population, the idea that it's fucking terrible.
Yeah.
I remember Warren Buffett actually wrote a letter once to his open letters to some newspaper going, look, my executive assistant pays more tax than I do, and I'm a billionaire. This is terrible. And he says, I can do it because this, and he actually showed how he did it, but this person can't, and so she can't get ahead. This is a terrible way to be. And it was interesting, you know, he's a schoolyard. But look, I'm grateful you're here. You must have gone a fair bit. I live in a part of the world. I live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. It's one of those cities where there's a kind of there's insular enclaves in the city. All right, it's the same in Brisbane. There's a river in the middle of it, so people from one part of it tend not to go to the other part. It's just how it happens, or they drive through it because the Gold Coast on the other side. But in this particular part of the city, it's a high pedestrian area. You end up knowing a lot of similar people, and you would have been very, very visual and very prominent when you first kind of went kind of public. When you got to uni, and so when, as that kind of went on, did that play any role in you wanting to go overseas to go to uni?
I think that, so I also grew up in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and it's a very particular community, and I think also the way the schools kind of work and interact with each other means that you could easily know the same people your whole life.
Look, it's the same thing in Brisbane. I grew up in Brisbane, and it's the same. There was a 30-year reunion not long ago, and I can guarantee there are guys who are still going out or now married to the same women that they met at a dance in 1991, and their kids all go to school. And, like, why would they ever need to know anyone that didn't go to those schools? They played rugby against each other.
And I mean, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, as in, yeah, that's definitely fine. But I think a big reason for me moving overseas was it was COVID as well, for context. So I felt very, like, claustrophobic in Sydney. And I think there was just very limited social interactions that were quite repetitive. But I mean, I wanted to go overseas for so long. It was kind of just, like, always on my radar that was my plan at some point. And then it just happened that by the time I finished my degree, it was mid-COVID, and I was like, I need to get out of here.
Right.
Yeah. So I did consider not doing it or doing it later, like deferring, because I didn't get to learn in person. It was online, and obviously, like, the experience moving overseas was also hindered by COVID. But I was like, nah, it's time to go.
You got to go.
Well, yeah, at the time, we didn't know how long it was going to go on for. So I was like, I'm not going to hold my life. What if this is still going on in 6 years? Like, got to move on.
It's good. And I love that, because it's very much, well, like, okay, well, what do we do from here? Like, this is what it is. Person I used to work with in music television, she used to say, it was funny because it was about relationships. She used to say, it is what it is and it isn't what it isn't.
Yeah.
So now what are you going to do? Yeah. And that was it. It was, okay, this is it. It might be, I like that. It's like, could be 6 more years. I'm not going to not go. So off you pop. And look, are you enjoying it?
Yeah, I'm finished now. I've graduated that now, but I loved it. And then I still live in London, which I also absolutely love. It is just really fun. I mean, Sydney is so, every time I'm back here, I'm like, why don't I live here? Like, it's so nice. It's sunny, like the beach, the lifestyle, seeing all my friends. It makes me so happy. But I just feel as though there's just so many, like, things to do in London. You can also, I always joke, like, the best thing about London is Europe. Like, you can so easily leave and get places that are so far from us over here.
Yeah, I mean, you're not
telling anyone who's travelled something I don't know already. Like I missed all that in my 20s. It was only in my 30s I lived overseas. I lived in America because I was working. But yeah, exactly right. And you should go. Absolutely. People have been doing it for decades in Australia, forever and ever and ever. And ever. People came to know you because of the Teachers Consent campaign, which I do want to talk to you about, obviously, because I remember when that came out, it really struck me because it's certainly not limited to Sydney or even this country. But what's been the effect of that being rolled out, do you think?
The effect of the consent education, the effect of the kind of conversation?
Oh, the effect of well, let's start with the education. Have you got any kind of metrics that you can look at?
So no metrics just yet, except so it only came into play this year. So it's, I guess, going to be quite hard. I think we're going to need a few years or if not a generation to be able to understand if this has had any sort of impact on rates of sexual violence. And it's also going to be very hard because, maybe consent education is improving things, but then maybe other factors are making things worse. And it's very hard to tell. But there actually is funding being allocated into starting to measure this. So the Human Rights Commission of Australia is doing a survey and we'll start sort of like trying to measure this and figuring out if there can be an impact. But I also think the conversation piece has been really massive. Like so many people have, obviously this isn't, evidence, but so many people have anecdotally told me the change in, family dynamics or like the removal of shame around these sort of things or the willingness to have these conversations, or they feel more encouraged to have conversations with their kids much younger because of these things. And I don't think we can dismiss what that will mean for the future of Australia.
I mean, yes, it is anecdotal and this isn't going to be in every case, but tell me about the family dynamics piece.
So, for example, one that like really struck with me is someone my age telling me that her mother and her grandmother were all watching, I think it was a 60 Minutes episode that Teachers Consent and like my work was being platformed in. And in that conversation, by seeing how her mum and her grandma reacted to the work I was doing in these sort of conversations in a very like empathetic way, the woman my age felt comfortable to tell them that she had been sexually assaulted. And as a result of that, both her mum and her grandma then said that they had both been sexually assaulted, and none of them had ever, her grandma had never told anyone and her mum had never told either her daughter or her mother.
Wow.
And then I think the woman my age had told people but not her family. And it just like alleviated shame and changed the kind of like communal understanding. And it's just like that's 3 generations of silencing that it was just broken by seeing that having a conversation about this and the confidence that you're not going to be met with a reaction that you don't want or that's going to upset you, what that can do to change, whole families.
Yeah. We mentioned before we started recording that we both know my friend Yumi, who's extraordinary. She, fucking hell, man, what she went through earlier this year around the publishing of her book was, she's nuts, man. It was fucking nuts, particularly because it was so backed by every academic, every law enforcement, every legal, expert, every person who's just a total ninja in child safety, and that people were just kind of taking it apart, and that it's not, how dare you talk to my kids about a thing, essentially, how dare you talk to my kids about a thing that I'm not comfortable talking to them about. Now, I'm sure, like this sex education, I did sex education in schools when I was 11, all right, so 1986. I'll bet there was a massive fight about that here in Australia. Was there much pushback around this sort of stuff coming into schools?
There definitely was certain pushback in certain areas, but overwhelmingly I was kind of surprised with how little. I think because the type of consent education that is being taught in schools has been, created by experts, informed by experts, being used off evidence-based, age-appropriate, the whole thing, exactly as you just said, kind of like checked by all these things. And the consequence of not having those conversations is just so wildly devastating that there definitely was certain pushbacks from certain groups, but overall I feel like there was support. And what was actually funny, so when the curriculum did get passed through and it was kind of announced, one of the ministers who I was working closely with on implementing this, his advisor sent me a text saying, in the end, it wasn't even controversial, and that's like true to cultural change, which I think when I started advocating for it, if they happened to do it the day after, it would have created this like massive backlash. But I think the country was kind of prepped with these conversations about consent and sexual assault and these sort of things. But yeah, I think unfortunately, like, obviously I think Yumi's book's great, and I don't know how that media blast just happened around that. But because like the thing that I kept not being able to wrap my head around with that is your kid's not going to buy the book themselves. Like you get to buy them the book. It's an incredible resource. Like, I don't understand why people are so angry about this thing that it's not as if like a 10-year-old's going to like walk into Big W with like $20 and I'm going to buy this today. So yeah.
The logic behind it is nuts, but it does lead me on to what another thing that has changed rapidly since you first started talking about this stuff is that, this is the argument at the time, is like, what are you talking about? Your kid has an iPad in their hands.
What do you think they're saying?
And you probably haven't put the parental controls on. And I can guarantee that if you're not in the room with them, I was 11 when I first saw hardcore pornography.
Well, that's the average age of first access in Australia.
8 is too late.
Yeah.
Ursula Carlson talks about that.
Oh my God.
That's what they say in New Zealand. 8 is too late. Because your kids, I remember, Audrey, I was still very new in Georgia's life. I met her when I was 10. I met Georgia when she was 10. But I remember Audrey having the conversation around, because you can do anything you want with your kid's phone. But ultimately you're at the bus stop and the kid next to you goes, hey, check this out.
Exactly. And that is often so much of how this content is shared. It's usually that, I always hear it from teachers, like it's the back of the school bus and it's kind of like in the locker room, or it's in these like places where parents aren't patrolling 24/7 and you can't, when has batting things for kids ever fully worked? It's like we need to educate them and support them in that so that they understand, what these things mean.
Is a lot of the conversations, they're difficult conversations to have because you don't want to imagine that your child would ever be assaulted, and you certainly don't want to imagine that your child would ever assault someone, let's be honest, like I say this quite a bit, but our youngest is 4, and if I am down the park with him and I look at the playground and there's, 30 kids, young boys his age, I'm like, 20 years from now, it's going to be one of you.
Yeah, more than one.
And it's fucking horrible because no parent wants their little beautiful son to grow up and be that.
I think that's part of the problem around this. I think that a lot of people with daughters very much fear that their daughter will become a statistic in this, but don't fear their son being one. And it's illogical because you can do so much to prevent your son from ever perpetrating violence on another, but you can only hope that the boys that your daughter is hanging out with, that their parents have done that sort of thing. So it should actually be a much more focus on how we're kind of having these conversations with boys and socializing them. Something that I find really interesting in this is in Australia, if you are a woman, you are more likely to be sexually assaulted or raped than you are to smoke cigarettes. And that is because of, large-scale public education around the health risks of cigarettes.
Yeah.
Taxes, resource allocation. It is because of every time you leave the house and you're going to a party, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do drugs, whatever. Like, that's what you get yelled out the door when you're 15 walking out. Are you walking out the door yelling, make sure you check for consent? It's, I think a lot of parents will probably be more worried that their kids are smoking cigs than thinking about sexual violence. And it's really scary.
I don't think it should be difficult to talk about not wanting the young men in our community to go on to perpetrate. I think it's important that we do talk about that. As you mentioned, we do focus a lot on trying to prevent people becoming victims. But that young man's going to destroy his life just as much,
Well, yeah, and I think the thing is tangibly this idea of like destroying someone's life. Like, does sexually assaulting someone guarantee that you will lose your job, end up in prison, like have any sort of accountability? Definitely not.
No.
Which is a problem. But so a large part of my book is actually about this idea of kind of mainly teenage boys or young adults who perpetrate sexual violence out of ignorance, entitlement, and a lack of awareness about or a lack of care for consent, rather than any sort of like intent or malice. And I feel deeply for these boys who do these things because they often grow up and realize what they've done is wrong and regret it and feel very like a lot of shame and guilt around the act. And preventing that is just as important. Like, it is just as much as an injustice on the boys in our community as the girls that our education system in the broadest sense of public education, parental education, teacher education, school system, that the main demographic in Australia of perpetrators of rape is a 15 to 19-year-old male.
Oh my God.
Which, again, talks about how early we need to be having these conversations.
And it's not that it's like the conversation around stranger danger is complete bullshit.
Absolute bullshit.
It is a family member who will generally be, if it's an adult and quite small child.
Well, yeah, that's in terms of, childhood sexual abuse for sure. But I also think in terms of something I didn't actually realize until I actually launched the campaign is this type of sexual violence that I talk about so specifically, this kind of like teen on teen perpetrated out of, lack of education, ignorance, blah, blah, blah. That is child sexual abuse being perpetrated by another child. And I don't think we kind of grapple with what that actually means when we're looking at this from a bigger picture and what that also means for accountability and stuff like that. Like, I don't think the criminal system is any place for children, regardless of crime. So how are we going to mesh those things together and figure out a way of moving forward when, one, it's so preventable, and two, it's such a kind of complex, intricate issue that I think needs to be seen as different to child sexual abuse perpetrated by adults and, adult on adult sexual assault.
Oh, I was just trying to, I guess, draw an analogue to we're looking in the wrong place.
Yes, 100%.
Essentially, because I've got to go and pick up my kid from school because they might get snatched. No, they fucking won't.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's somebody they already know if it's going to but that's the thing, the focus was always on that. You mentioned three things that I'm kind of fascinated by as the reasons why young men find themselves in this situation. And I'd love if we could unpack them a little bit. Talk to me about the ignorance part. What conversations we could have with the young guys in our lives that could alleviate that?
Well, I think the thing is exactly what you're saying. We have these very strict stereotypes of what sexual assault looks like and what we think it's going to be. It's the scary man in the alleyway when you're walking home at night. We don't realize that it's, much more likely a guy you have a crush on and who you're, consensually kissing at the beginning of the night but don't want to be doing anything else with at the end of the night. And those stereotypes, I think, allow young people to perpetrate acts of sexual violence without being conscious of it. And those acts don't just come out of nowhere. They're not just, exhibited. There's attitudes and expectations around boys and girls and the way they should experience life and do life that sets up very robust structures for those more insidious acts of sexual harassment and sexual assault to then occur. It starts with a sexist joke. It starts with misogynistic attitudes. It leads to groping. It leads to flashing in the street. It leads to image-based abuse. And then it leads to rape. And the normalization of those kind of lower levels that are seen as less explicit or less insidious forms of sexual violence allow those higher ones to occur and allow them to be classified as normal. And I think that's where the ignorance comes in. So, for example, when I got my consent talk when I was 15 years old, the things that kind of blew my mind were finding out that one, oral sex can count as rape. Two, someone that you know or like or love, your boyfriend can be the perpetrator of sexual violence. And just because you're dating someone doesn't mean that consent is automatic. And three, that intoxication makes consent void. And also, finally, that consent was needed in a sexual act for it to not count as a form of sexual assault or sexual violence. And I think the ignorance of that means that the weight of a lot of young boys' actions isn't often completely understood. I think that's a serious tragedy because, again, that's what I mean. People grow up, learn, reflect, and then have to sit in that shame or guilt if they feel like it. Not that all do, but yeah.
It is really quite difficult. I don't think you have any reason to believe it isn't, but I remember being a young guy. I'm one of four brothers. I went to an all-boys school. The only woman that wasn't my mum was my accounting teacher and one music teacher. I only knew this world. I only knew that, to be punched really hard in the arm is a way of saying hello. I fucking hated that, but that's what it was. I didn't feel in place at all, but to fit in, that stuff, behaviors like that start to show up so you can be, to fit in that kind of, we talk about peer pressure, but I don't think that's really it. It's not about, doing nangs at the park because of peer pressure. It's
It's like the cultural norms.
Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go. That's it. And how that sort of stuff can start. And boy, it starts early.
Oh my God, it starts unbelievably early. It starts from before we're even conscious of it. I mean, there's studies showing that if you dress newborn babies in like pink or blue, the way that parents who don't know the babies or strangers interact with them is like wildly different depending on if they assume they're a boy or they're a girl. So those kind of like cultural contexts are set before we can even like fathom that they're being set.
Right. If you're the parent of a young man, how do you talk to them about if you start to see their, let's just say, their standards slipping from what it is you raised them to be?
It's often not surprising when, you know, you hear an allegation or, you know, someone tells you something or discloses something. It's often not surprising where that came from there. So it's like, well, what were all the signs that made it not surprising to us, and how could we have stopped them at that point and like changed the culture? And I think if you're a parent of a young boy, looking at that is really important. So I mean, you know, the mantra "boys will be boys" is, you know, here, there, and everywhere, and it's such an excuse for kind of whether it's destructive behavior or like punching each other in the arm. Like that's the most classic, like, oh, boys will be boys. Like, why are you guys punching each other in the arm? I don't know, because they want to do it. Like, whatever. It's not necessarily like maybe overtly harming anyone as such, but it's also not the most, you know, appropriate way to greet someone. So thinking about how those kind of like small actions can be held to account, and also how you can take every opportunity you get to have these sort of conversations. So, you know, maybe you're watching a movie and there's a sex scene that comes up. You know, everyone's been there when a sex scene's up with your parents and you're mortified and embarrassed and you just like pretend not to look, blah, blah, blah. Does the sex scene show consent? Almost definitely not. Take that opportunity to be like, this is not real because you should always do this. Or, you know, are you watching a rom-com from the 2000s and is the guy, you know, obsessively chasing the girl and refusing to take no for an answer and following her everywhere and calling her phone? But like, actually, that's kind of stalking.
Yeah.
Like, these things aren't okay. And you're just in the most lighthearted way, you can kind of bring these things up and like correct the media that's being consumed from like so many other angles to say, that's actually not how healthy relationships
Every
work.
Twilight movie ever.
I know. Oh my God. I was literally watching Twilight with my friends the other day, and my friend Bella like turned around to me and she was literally like, Chanel, you need to do a PhD about consent in Twilight. And I was literally like, she was joking. We were talking about, she was doing her PhD and we were joking about how much content there is. And she was like, you could literally write a thesis on this. And I was like,
what's her name? He says to her, I want to kill you every second of the day. And she says, oh, I'm so in love.
and I mean, he forces her. He's like, I'm not, you know, we can't do this unless we get married, and like, I'm not going to do this. And like, there's so much coercion in there, and there's a power imbalance. He's like 107 or something, and she's like 19.
Half your age plus 7 doesn't come near it.
No, it's not. It doesn't meet the rule.
It's very, I mean, look, you know, they're teenage vampires, and so we know it's not real,
I know.
but it's a very odd.
I mean, it also set the scene for like what so many like girls in my generation think is romantic and stuff like that. And it's also really interesting, the types of romance that like women are shown in the media is often this very overbearing, like coercive, protective, like jealous type of man. Like a lot of the movies we grew up with kind of depicted that trope.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily healthy in any way, shape or form.
No.
I mean, I was even thinking about the other day, like school texts, how English texts, the amount of times we could have had these conversations there. Romeo and Juliet. He's 16. She's 13. Not great. Like a few years of that age makes a massive difference. There's a serious power imbalance there. Let's talk about it. Like, I don't know, Atonement. We did Atonement for our year 11 text. It's literally about a rape, and that was fine, but apparently it wasn't okay to talk to us about sexual consent in our own lives. And so there's so many options here and opportunities where you can just address these things consistently.
When it comes to being a young man and those things being normalized, and, you know, when you're pretty young, I remember being really young. At first it was drawing, you know, before there was memes, it was like drawing pictures, you know, and like that stuff being normalized, and we're trying to outdo each other with how extreme it got. And like I remember it being kind of playful. And then as, you know, puberty kicked in for all of us and our voices changed and we got bigger, then now it's kind of a bit more, kind of, I guess, real. Now that would all take place on a group chat, and you would want to outdo each other all the time. How do you say to a young guy in a group chat with all the people he sees not only like he's in the group chat before he gets to school, and he's in the, with them face to face at school, and he's with the group chat until he puts his phone down at night. How do you say to a guy like that, "Hey, you're going to have to call that out, buddy"? Like, how does that happen?
Well, I mean, I honestly think in that like very specific situation, there's so much power in boys a few years older having these sort of conversations. Like the boys who, maybe did these things in year 8 and now they're in year 12 and they regret it, or maybe they're in year 12 and they never did it, but they're glad they didn't. And having those conversations and kind of seeing your peers, or like your peers who are a bit older who you respect, because, when you're young, someone a few years above you at school is like so scary and so cool, and like, their word's God, telling you these sort of things, because I think it is really. And the thing is, there's always going to be so many bystanders in a situation, and it sounds so cliche, but the thing is, if someone calls it out, there's probably about 10, 20 people in that group chat who feel relieved that it got called out. There's only a few who would feel kind of insulted by it. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, when we were doing a teacher's consent strategy the other day, we were literally like, we just need to make consent cool. Like, how do we make teenage boys want to be consensual? Like, how do we show to them that it's really cool to have a healthy, loving, intimate relationship where you still have sex, but because she wants to and because you want to and for like good reasons?
Well, I think this is where the vast quantities of complete fantasy-based porn come into play here, because it's you never see it. And you never see it. And that is, I mean, it is not the default sex education. It is sex education.
Yeah, it's the main form of sex education. And it's the most, it's unbelievably explicit. How are we meant to counteract that? And most mainstream pornography depicts violence against women. And in almost all of those cases, they're either being passive or, happy about that, which means that pornography is also massively victimizing girls, because it's also their form of sex education and what they think this sort of situation is supposed to be like. Yeah, it's really terrifying. That's why, again, it's going to be so hard to kind of measure if consent education is going to do anything, because at the same time, pornography is only getting more explicit. People are accessing it younger. It's getting more real. People are getting VR headsets, like all these sort of things that are distorting reality of the sexual landscape for young people.
With kind of mainstream porn, there's the kind of, I guess, implicit idea that someone there's getting paid, right? When you come to something like OnlyFans, which is this, the narrative is like, I'm an independent creator, this is me, this is my job, work is work. How does that play into this narrative?
Oh, it's tough. It is really tough. I just want to quickly separate the idea of an individual porn actor from the industry, because it is a really hard to consolidate idea that some individual people and women find pornography, empowering, and they would rather do that than other forms of work, whilst at the same time it is an industry that is disproportionately exploitative towards women and children as well. So as a feminist looking at that, it's kind of this tension between something that like benefits an individual will be at odds with the collective in this sense. And for me, I'm coming at it with a lens of, I don't know how we can ever tell if someone's consented to being there. There's no way to tell if someone's had an agent read over their contract and, they're getting paid a fair wage and they've agreed to what they're doing before and, consent's being given, versus someone who's been human trafficked into the, industry. That's something that I, as a, personal consumer, which is why I don't watch pornography, I do not consume pornography. It's like, that's my ethics base. I'm not judging people who do, just same as like, some people are vegetarian. I personally eat meat. But, yeah, and then OnlyFans is an interesting one, because I understand it was kind of created for this idea of trying to fix that issue and being like, okay, well, that, they're getting paid and they're making their own content and blah, 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 blah. But if OnlyFans was an economy, it would be the most unequal economy in the world. The amount of money that the top income earners earn is astronomical, but the vast majority of people on the platform earn pretty much nothing, and there's a massive disparity in that.
So kind of like the idea that the 1% of the world you could fit inside a Greyhound bus.
Yeah, it's like...
And then there's everybody else.
Exactly. So it's more unequal than any country we have in the world.
Wow. Okay.
So there's, South Africa where, millions live in poverty, and then there's also squillionaires. Right. And it's more unequal than that.
And by saying that, you're saying, like, so people get into that looking to be the aspirational
Yeah.
thing, but find themselves as one of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people.
Statistically, but then also those kind of like 1%ers, like, you know, the Anna Pauls, the Stella Baris, whatever, they're platformed, they have social media, they encourage it, they promote this lifestyle that, you know, I personally follow both of them on TikTok and Instagram and absolutely love them. And I think they're really funny. You know, they post their hot takes and like they have this lifestyle that sounds like incredible, obviously. But that's not the reality of sex work for most people around the globe, or even people in OnlyFans. Like, we have to think about, you know, street sex workers and understand the differences between that. So, yeah, it's a roundabout way of saying it's very complicated. And again, I'm not saying that this is not an individual person's, like, issue or, like, it's nothing to do with them. Like, if an individual sex worker wants to do that work, then that's fine. But on a separate issue, we need to understand that the industry as a whole is something that is disproportionately exploitative towards women. I mean, even just the simple fact that watching anything on Pornhub, no matter how, you know, even if it's kind of like a quote unquote like ethical porn video, like if consent's being shown or, you know, whatever, watching anything on that platform is giving profit to a company that time and time again has hosted child sexual abuse material. So for me, in the work I do, it's just like an absolute no-go just because it's not worth the risk of what I think, like what I believe in and what I want to contribute to as a consumer.
We've talked about the risks of if you're going into becoming a sexually active person with using porn as your main, I guess, model of how it works. Not great. You may discover things that you think that looks fun, but how you navigate a situation to get to be with someone that you trust enough to do that, that's another story. I'm married. This is my second marriage. There was a period in the middle there. It was about 3 years of just awfulness. And in the middle of that, there was about 13 months where I was on Tinder, which had only just been invented.
Nice.
This was
an OG.
oh, mate, yeah. It literally had just started. And it was fucking horrible. It was a vacuous hellhole of just the worst of everything. Because men would go on that app when they were horny and women would go on that app when they were lonely. And you would just get this complete thing. And like that's just in the straight world. There's gay mates of mine who, you know, before even smartphones, mate, the homosexual, they're on board. They had this stuff lined right up and we were still on dial-up internet. But it's just holes. It's cocks and holes. You don't see a face, you don't see a smile. The dehumanizing effect of that has got to play a role in consent and lack of consent when it comes to actually being physically in the room with somebody.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I mean, I think the idea of, you know, judging someone's personality off 5 photos or, you know, a photo of their dick or something.
Holding a fish and a dick.
At the same time.
I'm sure that exists somewhere.
I'm sure, yeah.
It's tiger, fish, 10 blokes. Which one?
Yeah, which one are you? Yeah.
You? No.
I think that dating apps have become much more kind of like normalized now, whereas I think when they came out, they very much had a reputation of being like, this is like Tinder, at least when I was younger, when it first came out, it was very much like, this is like to get laid, like this is like to do this. And I think that kind of has evolved. I think most people now use dating apps in one shape or form, but we definitely can't dismiss how like this idea of there's like always someone better who could just be a swipe away can kind of change our mindset around like commitment and intimacy and like self-worth as well, knowing that how just like it does create a narrative of disposability. I think that's not necessarily always true. I know some people who have met, you know, partners on dating apps, gotten married to them, are so happy. Like it's obviously an incredible tool for connecting people in a world that, you know, where we've become increasingly less social in the real world. But I think this idea of the kind of like objectification of a person and even taking it off dating apps just to social media in general, like some of the, you know, images that like young boys engage in and see or like what's normal. And I think that all definitely does come into play, and it comes into play in a way that we need to toe that line between how do we ensure that women are free to, you know, wear whatever they want, post whatever they want, all those things, do whatever they want without being subjected to unwanted attention or harassment as like in retaliation of that. And it's a very hard line to toe in a world that has consistently told all people that doing those sort of things is is trying to attract that sort of attention when it's actually not the case a lot of the time. Like, it's always, you always see on like TikTok or like memes and stuff like that, people being like, I'm not dressing up for boys, like I'm dressing up for the girls, like I'm dressing up for me, like as if I would dress up for you. You guys don't even care, like stuff like that. And it's like, how do we get rid of that idea that someone's clothes can be consent or an invitation? We have had this kind of massive sexual revolution and like apparently the liberation of sexuality, especially for kind of women or anyone who's basically not a straight man as well, like, and
Straight white man.
Straight, yeah. And in that process, kind of like in the era of Playboy and when the contraceptive pill got created, which changed the way that men and women could like biologically engage in sex and how often they could, and the risks associated with it were heavily lowered of unwanted pregnancy. And that has been accelerated really fast because ultimately the sexual liberation of women benefits men. However, the gender equality movement has not caught up with that sexual liberation, which means that it hasn't actually been true liberation. We've just kind of like created more women for men to have sex with and like normalize that in a way. And looking at it from kind of like an economic perspective, if you kind of think about like supply and demand, we get into a position where not only just because of like power structures and like gendered norms and stuff like that, but also literally just because of like simply the amount of people. So for example, this also goes into this in my book, in the university context, there are in most, high income countries in the world, there are now more women in university students than male university students. And I know I'm speaking in a very heteronormative framework right now, but just to like simplify the conversation. And in terms of kind of like competing for partners, again, speaking in an economic sense, this idea of like basic principles of supply and demand, women need to lower their expectations and their standards of how they are treated in order to even compete in the sexual market if they want to be involved in it at all, because there is just another person there for someone that they may be interested in to like go to. And I feel like, also interesting in the context of, what you do when you're not on this podcast, like those sort of environments of like dating has become like a form of competition almost, and it is like a sexual economy.
Yeah. I would particularly in the season that is yet to air, I certainly hope some of those conversations end up in the final cut. Women who are in their early 30s, just talking about like the relationships that they're in. And bear in mind, this might not make the edit, so depending on what story they choose to go with, because you're shooting a lot of footage for 1 hour show. The depth of the relationships that they're experiencing, and they're old enough to know what it was like to have a deep, loving, vulnerable connection with somebody. The depth of the relationships they're experiencing in the dating world are just people like, oh, it's Saturday night and look, I've got to go. I've got an early start tomorrow. Like, really? It's 9:30. No, you're meeting someone after this. Fuck, come off it.
Yeah.
But that happens that can happen on both fronts, because there's always, he's not quite 6 foot enough.
Yeah.
He might be a little more 6 foot. There might be a bit more of a finance bro one swipe away. And so never really competing. But I kind of wanted to get to this point in that the approach, the way to speak to someone is becoming a fucking lost art to actually make an initial, hey, how you going? It's almost easier to slide into a DM or put a like on a photo.
Definitely.
And then comment and then where are you? And then now I'll come and say hello wherever you might be at a party, or I've seen you on Instagram, I liked your photo a few weeks before, and now here we are in the same space. What does it do for us if we, don't have those kind of, that skill set of what it is to kind of front up and say, hey?
It's so hard, isn't it? Because it's kind of like an everyone problem, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, because again, like so many people have been connected through this form of technology and you meet people, outside of your social circle, or people you would never usually engage with, or, someone liking your Instagram story, when it's a photo of yourself or something like that, that is basically like a, hey, how you going at a party? But yeah, it is really sad, the idea that we've kind of lost that. Like if someone kind of comes and speaks to you in public, one, I think a lot of people are scared to do that. And then two, I think a lot of people are almost like off put, like being like, why are you doing this? You're a stranger. Are you weird? Like this is creepy, stranger danger almost.
Well, they're safer if a stranger shows up in a DM.
Yeah, because you can check them out. You can see your mutual friends, like you can whatever. But I mean, it's even like buses and stuff like that. Like when I used to go to school on the bus, we would all just be on our phones pretty much. Whereas like when my dad used to go to school on the bus and my mum used to go to school, like they would talk to each other.
I met the woman, she's a woman now, but we were 17 at the time. The woman I lost my virginity to, I met her on the bus.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you chat and you speak and you speak to a random, whereas like when we used to catch the bus, there would be people on it and you know who they are, but yeah, you'd follow them on Instagram or Facebook in those days, add them on Facebook, and that meant that the next day you could be like, hey.
Right.
And like, so it's kind of, I don't know, it's just like, I think that's just changed forever, the way we kind of...
How does that play into, how does that inability to have even that kind of because it's an emotional connection moment to say to someone, look them in the eye and say, hey, how you going? How does that play when it comes to the consent conversation? If we're starting to lack skills with actually just speaking to each other that isn't a text, where does that come into the consent conversation?
I mean, I guess in a few ways. I mean, I guess it means that we're losing the skill to kind of read body language and like understand if someone wants to speak to you or not, because, you know, someone might say hey to you, you might be like, hey, and someone might say hi to you, you might be like, hi. And like the difference between that, you probably couldn't hear it through the audio, but you know, that's something you can see.
It's very clear, don't
And also in that the idea that you only kind of approach new people for the purpose of romantic or sexual encounters, that is also quite sad and creepy. Because why aren't you just like, you can also make friends on the bus. Like, you know, I've also made lots of friends on the bus when I used to catch the bus to school all the time, whatever, girls in other schools, girls in your above, like boys in other schools, whatever. But if it's become that you only like someone's Instagram story, if you're trying to kind of like, you know, do a sneaky whatever, what does that mean for the way that we're telling people to interact with the kind of like gender that they're interested in, and the fact that you can't just have social interaction for the purpose of friendship as well?
The body language thing is a really interesting skill set to develop. You know, I see it in both our kids, but I got to see it with Wolf from the start, in that they don't know, so they look to you. You see their eyes come to you to see how to react to a situation, and they learn, and then they copy. The shittest thing about being a parent is they don't do what you tell them, they do what you show them, and you fucking find out pretty quick that, oh no, I should sort that out, because I just saw a 3-year-old do a thing I hate about myself. Okay. But the idea that, you know, learning that when I say something, I mean, he's 4 right now, and so he's learning that if he says something kind of mean to somebody, it feels shitty inside him too. He makes that person cry. Not that he is a mean kid, but like at the age of 4, I don't want to throw him under the bus. I don't want to throw him under the bus. Like, but it's when we're young, we learn when I say something mean to another person, they might get upset, but then I also feel kind of icky in my body, and I learn maybe it's not nice to go around being mean to people, because I don't like it either. It feels awful. I remember the first time I punched a kid who was being a proper bully to me, I cried. I was 14.
Yeah.
And I'm in the middle of my all-boys school playground, and I'm crying because I felt so horrible that I punched this kid. He never touched me again, but it was awful. It was awful, you know. So to deprive ourselves of learning that and learning those moments, learning micro-expressions, learning what hands shapes, learning body language, learning closed-up body positions, open body positions.
I think that's a big thing, like closed body positions, open, like tense, calm, because most consent is inferred from body language. It's actually like less often explicitly words. It's much more, you know, a kind of like vibe and enthusiasm. And yeah, I mean, I really feel bad for the kids who are kind of like, you know, like 14, 15, 16 around the COVID years, who lost those like very formative years of social interaction in the school system and like very much were isolated at home, you know, probably consuming like copious amounts of pornography, and how that's changed. So the average age of sexual intercourse for men in the UK is increasing, like young men, because they are kind of getting their form of intimacy, which is not real intimacy, and all that also has extreme like health and like psychological risk to it as well, is from pornography rather than kind of like human to human connection. And that's really sad.
Yeah, so the amount of single people is increasing. because, you can get off by yourself in ways hitherto never before invented, in the most extraordinary USB-powered Bluetooth, machines invented. And there's this transactional nature of sex that you don't essentially necessarily have to pay for. So you're not going to a sex worker. But I was quite shocked the first time that, I went on a Tinder date and, and I thought I'm doing the right thing, and I've just been sober for about 3 years, so I wanted to have a very different relationship to sex and sexuality as a sober person. And, I remember this woman was older than me, and I remember buying her dinner and whatever, and she's like, so when are we going to fuck? And I was just like so taken aback. She was 38. And I was like, she's like, I'm not here to eat dinner. And I was like, now?
God, I can't believe that. I feel like, I don't know, maybe that's still the case with some things, but I feel like that's definitely changed. I feel like, again, Tinder in its inception was kind of like known for that, whereas I feel like now it's a bit more
This is 2013.
Yeah, I don't know.
So this is 10 years ago.
I don't know. I was at school then. I
Right,
was far off Tinder,
Yeah, I was what? I was 39?
Yeah.
I was 39. It was before I met Audrey. And I just remember being so like, I feel really weird.
Well, that is confronting. And I think that's also talks to this kind of idea that like men are supposed to always be down for sex and like that they always want it, and that's, the only reason you were there, that she's kind of like falsely assuming that.
Yeah.
Whereas that also like contributes to a culture where there's no room for intimacy, when that's expected of men, therefore they act in that way to meet those sort of expectations.
Yeah. As someone who used to drink, there's a very big difference between having sex when you're drinking and when you're not drinking, in the way that your brain works and the way that the dopamine systems and things work. But I definitely remember when I just recall it speaking to you now, feeling so weird without having that any kind of personal connection there. And I know that sounds quite wild because, we're often told that, for a woman to be ready for sex, there has to be an emotional moment involved in the oxytocin release to allow parts of their body to create the environment for sex to occur, unless there's lots of lube around. But that is also the case for men.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Why wouldn't it be?
And there's bits of your body that just don't work if that isn't there in some case. Certainly was for me when I was a young man.
Yeah.
And it just really freaking blew my mind.
It's actually so funny. I am thinking, I don't think I've ever had sex drunk, because I don't think I could have sex drunk.
Right.
Because I don't think I could have that level of presence and emotional intimacy that I desire out of that, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's it's odd the way that I grew up and how I grew up and who I grew up with. And bear in mind, I left this school 17, and within 6 months I was working for a bunch of like road warrior kind of cover band before DJ, so were things called cover bands. I was the youngest. There was next guy older than me was 10 years older than me. He was 27. I was 17. No, I was just 18. So he was 28 and I was 18. And some of them were quite a bit older. And the way that they spoke about women, I wanted to fit in. It was like, unhealthy masculinity. I'm not a fan of the word of calling masculinity toxic, because I don't think that is a very helpful way to describe things. There's healthy and unhealthy masculinity, because if you're talking about toxic masculinity, well, what's the option? But if we talk about healthy or unhealthy,
we can go into that if you want.
I'd love to. I'd love to, because I know we've been focusing a lot on men and young boys in this conversation, but I think it's really, really important, because as a young man, like, where are you going to go? And you talked about being on the bus before and like not wanting to initiate a conversation. Yeah, when you're really, I can only, from my own experience, being so reluctant to speak to anybody new, yet when I looked at this particular person, there was just gigantic hormonal rage in my body that gave me the effort to go, oh, I will go and speak to her because this feels good. And it definitely was that I hadn't yet figured out that women could be friends. I didn't know that was a thing. And so that was a big part of me having that conversation as a 17-year-old, I think I met her when I was 16 and then we went up together at 17. And to be a young man just fucking raging with hormones, I remember being like,
you can put on 15 kilos in 6 months. And suddenly you can go from being like this kind of dweeby person before summer, and then you wake up one morning and then suddenly you can literally just walk through a wall. You just like become the Hulk. You become superpowered. And
God, it sounds so weird.
it is. It's really strange.
That, yeah.
But it's really strange.
I know exactly what you mean, because sometimes, I don't see my friends' younger siblings for a few months and I'm like, what the hell? Or like, yeah. And you're like, what?
Yeah. And they're like 180 and we're 100 kilos of meat. But they're still, and they're just literally driving a bulldozer with the brain power of a 15-year-old.
And also, like, in teen years, again, like hormonally, or like in order to kind of take more risks and also break away from our parents in those adolescent years, we also usually feel less empathy in those time periods of our life. Which is, encourages us to take risks and do things and learn and have these moments of punching someone and being like, that felt really bad, but, not having enough to do it in the first place, but then be like, oh, wait, and like figure out that journey. I mean, when you're a teenager, everyone's always like, oh, like being a teenager is so hard, and you're always like, shut up. But like when you look back on it, you're like, God, I'm glad that's over.
Empathy is a really important thing. How would you speak to a young woman or a young man who, as you mentioned, the teen-on-teen situation is the thing you kind of your work focuses on. How do you speak to a young man who's the concept of empathy for a woman, a stranger that he hasn't met yet, or one he's got the hots for on Instagram? How do you speak to them about that?
So also just to kind of like contextualize this, the pretty much like premise of like all the work I do and also the whole book is this idea of this type of sexual assault occurs when entitlement outweighs empathy. So entitlement to someone else's body outweighs your empathy towards them as a human. And we only need to flip that up a little bit. We only need to be a little bit more empathetic to people to make it that sexual assault would just be an anomaly and something that would be really strange to do. But the whole point is it becomes normalized because of this entitlement. And I think the thing is, people think like, oh, it's so hard to teach empathy, but it's actually not, because one, humans are inherently empathetic. It's an anomaly if someone is not empathetic. That means they have some sort of personality disorder. And two, we're extremely good at embedding empathy in our girls. We just fail to do it with our boys. And the thing is, we tend to socialize empathy in boys very well about the kind of people like immediately around them. But what we fail to do is to extend that reach. And that's not just talking about women. I'm also talking about, all forms of marginalized identities, whether it's like queer people or whether it's like refugees or like, people of a different race, like people of a different class, like all these different things. And it can literally be as simple as like reading them bedtime stories when they're 4 years old about these other different types of characters that aren't in their direct realm. We spoke about growing up in Sydney's eastern suburbs. It's a very elite place in terms of class, in terms of race. It's extremely exclusive. There is only a very specific dynamic that demographic that you tend to kind of like engage with unless you make active strides to get outside of that. And a lot of Australia is kind of like segregated in those different ways. And we have really high amounts of single-sex education institutions in Australia, which again, you're only around, you said it before as well, you're around your brothers and besides your mom, and you're like, few teachers, there weren't women around. So how do we extend that empathy and teach people to feel it beyond the people that are only relevant to them? And I think storytelling, engaging, taking the time to kind of like, I mean, it seems almost so obvious to say, but yeah, like put yourself in their shoes, like think about how would they feel about that. And from a really young age, doing that with storybooks, and then when they're maybe older, doing it with things that appear on TV or movies, or getting them to watch movies from different cultures or have conversations, or like a movie that highlights the experience of womanhood or things like that, or a documentary. And then also just like media and news articles. Like literally every day we're blasted with this sort of information, taking the time to be like, let's read this more than just a headline. What does this actually mean for the people that this headline is about?
The reporting of the Higgins trials. Like, she was never on trial, motherfuckers.
Exactly. The language.
She was never on trial. But how can you because it can get pretty welded on, particularly in all male cohorts, particularly when there is a huge value placed on that kind of blokey, arm punchy kind of lack of empathy, women as objects thing. I knew someone who
an actor, and one of the jobs she had a long time ago was she was working for a large sporting league, and the job was to go into essentially daytime team meetings of the team, either first grade or junior teams, and she would read out victim impact statements in character to try and like talk to the men in the room about this is someone speaking about having been a victim of an assault. And the person leading this particular day said, what do you think about that, to one of the guys in the room? And would you want that to happen to your sister? No. Well, what about her? Well, she's just some slut. Like that seems pretty fucking rusted on. So how do you even combat that? How do you even approach that?
Well, that means that man can only feel empathy for people directly related to them, which again is often like heavily socialized into boys and men. And I mean,
I've had a chat with Jenny and the girls.
Yeah. I mean, he got absolutely like shat on for that, but that's how a lot of people in
that was his experience, though.
Yeah, that's what so many people think and feel, and that's the only way. That is actually, again, chapter. Sorry, I don't mean to keep intentionally plugging this. I guess
you're here to plug a book. You were dropped off by a publicist. It's fine.
There's a chapter called "He's Someone's Son, He's Someone's Father, He's Someone's Brother," and it's on the pretense of flipping the script of how so often we try to bring men along in the preventing violence against women movement, or preventing male violence, whatever you want to call it, by trying to say like, oh, this could be your daughter or your sister or your mother, and people get very offended when it's that. But I don't understand how there's that disconnect between thinking whatever world I'm creating is how people are going to treat, like the way I treat someone else's sister, someone else's mother, someone else's daughter is how people are going to treat mine. And I think a lot of fathers freak out and get very protective over their daughters when they realize that men are going to treat them the way that they treated women for a lot of their lives. And I think it can be really confronting. I mean, yeah, Kanye West, violent crimes, I know he's cancelled, but like the way he talks about Northwest, saying like he doesn't want her to have curves like his mum. It's like you literally married like the sex icon of our generation. And you're now worried that men are going to objectify your daughter. Like, what have you been doing for the last however many years on your music videos? And you're like...
Great songs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, as in, everyone thought that was such a weird song for him to make, to be like, oh my God, you're objectifying your daughter. And I'm literally like, isn't this what all, like, men and dads think? Like, they freak out that their daughters are going to be treated the way that they've treated women their whole life.
I went through it with Georgia, and it was really hard to subvert because it's this primal thing that you want to... But ultimately, Audrey speaking with Georgia about, making sure she knew her value, knew her worth, was smart about things, but that changed who she is in a room, and the way she spoke about the power dynamic, and I can't remember the words, but it was extraordinary about not giving part of yourself away for the attention of somebody, essentially.
And also I think on the other side of this, like I know we've spoken about boys and men a lot in their socialization, but the way women are socialized is often to be over-accommodating of people, often to be people pleasers, often to put your own self and your comfort second, which just creates this kind of like perfect environment for someone's boundaries to be very easily compromised and for them to like let it happen, in inverted commas, let it happen, but they don't actually want it to happen. And then it's a situation and it's like, okay, well, maybe it was still consent, but it wasn't desired. And like, how do we kind of navigate that? And yeah, empowering young women, teaching them how to say no. Like, we always say no means no, but we don't teach girls how to say it. We teach them to feel really bad when they say it.
What can it sound like?
What can no sound like? I mean, it can be like, I don't feel like doing this. I don't like, why don't we go back to the party? Like, why don't we just kiss for a bit? Can we just cuddle for a bit? But also, like I said, most consent is through body language. Like if someone has to kind of like explicitly give you a no, it kind of almost means you maybe have gone too far because it means you haven't picked up on those cues that you're not interested. Because a lot of the time it is someone tensing, it is someone turning away, it is someone not being interested. And it should actually sound more like, are you okay? Are you comfortable? And like that kind of check in an affirmative way. And give someone the space to be like, actually, let's just chill for a bit. But I'm not just talking about in sexual situations. I'm talking about you know, all situations, whether it's like doing extra tasks at work or like, you know, staying somewhere later, like going to a party you don't want to go to, just consistently failing to put your own true desires first. And I think that's like massively translated into the sexual landscape, especially when we have like so much taboo around female sexuality and what women experience and how they want to experience sex.
Do you think we're going to be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we will be okay. I mean, I do have high hopes. Sometimes I'm so unbelievably disheartened, but the vast majority of sexual violence in Australia is preventable, especially sexual violence that occurs teen on teen, child on child. We can prevent that. I have absolutely no doubt that it is possible. We just need people to be willing to. And it means sitting in hard conversations. It means reflecting. It means like questioning biases. It means all these things that are like not necessarily easy to do, but it's 100% possible if people want to. It's just not being prioritized.
And it's definitely easier than dealing with the consequences of
Sexual violence, sexual assault, rape. Yeah,
absolutely.
Whether you're a perpetrator or a victim, especially, you know, victim survivors, but it's fucking everywhere. Rape culture is fucking everywhere. But it means we can get rid of it really quickly as well.
There's always something to do.
We can put something else out there. Yeah.
Thanks for writing the book. Thanks for coming by.
Yeah, I actually think, again, not trying to shameless plug, but a lot of people have said this feels like a toolkit to start dismantling these sort of things and takes a look at the normal.
As I said to Yumi, I'll say to you, like, I wish that this conversation was so public when I was a teenager. So much so.
Yeah.
That's not to say anything except, but, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
Like, I wish this was around.
Yeah.
I really do.
Well, thank you for having me and
Are you
having this
kidding,
conversation.